Alright guys, how's it going? Believe it or not, but it has been 3 years since my video, The GPU War is Over, which remains one of my personal favourites till this day. It's a sad video detailing how being the best doesn't necessarily guarantee that you win, or even get close to what you deserve. For years, around the 2010 mark, AMD were dominant in graphics, while Nvidia reeled from one disaster to the next. But Nvidia continued to make far more money anyway. And when AMD failed to show up for the high-end graphics battle against Pascal in 2016, Nvidia went on to make so much money that to me it looked like they had now got out of sight. And up until this middle of 2016 point, AMD and ATI, they previously always had launched first on the new manufacturing node, but on 14nm and 16nm FinFET, Nvidia were just ahead, by about a month. One major reason for that would have been AMD's move to Global Foundries, while Nvidia remained at TSMC. Global Foundries historically lagged TSMC by 6 months or more, but really, even had AMD launched first at TSMC, it wouldn't have made any real difference to that generation. As I said, they failed to turn up at the high-end battle, releasing Polaris only for the mid-range and below. Vega appeared a year later and could only just match Nvidia's previous year's GTX 1080. An absolutely disastrous result for AMD with their hot, loud, and thanks to HBM2, expensive to produce card. Nvidia moved further ahead while staying on the same node with a rebranded name. TSMC's 16nm was now 12nm, and Nvidia launched Turing, stealing the headlines with RTX ray tracing. We knew that 7nm was coming next, but I had pretty much given up on ever seeing any kind of competitive graphics environment again. To me, Nvidia had won. And my reasoning was fairly simple, I guess. With AMD historically always being in the lead to the next manufacturing node, often by 6 months or more, now that Nvidia had caught up at 14/16nm, then they would surely be at least the same on 7nm or possibly even ahead. And the logic just told me that with all this money that Nvidia had made on 16nm, and with AMD being somewhat starved of cash, 7nm could have ended up a slaughter. Could you imagine Turing shrunk to 7nm while AMD toiled with a 14nm Vega? That is what I imagined, but it isn't what happened. During 2017, we heard Mark Papermaster talk about how 7nm was a tough lift, the toughest in generations, which required close collaboration, not just with TSMC, but on the 7nm tools as well. And Papermaster continued to sing this tune throughout 2018, and we learned early in the year, somewhat surprisingly, that Vega would be their first 7nm product. While literally no one was excited by the prospect, it was a sensible choice to slightly modify and shrink a current chip rather than attempt an all-new architecture on a new node. So 7nm Vega launched at the tail end of the year, and in fact, AMD were again first to the new node on 7nm. However, the underlying architecture was so bad that they were still a long way behind in performance per watt, and not just against Turing, but also against Nvidia's previous 16nm Pascal architecture. But just how far ahead on 7nm were AMD? That was tough to know with any certainty. What was certain, the long-awaited Navi chips were late, and I began to hear grumblings of discontent from some insiders. They had managed to hit the targeted clock speeds for Navi, but power draw was again an issue. The 5700 XT launched in the middle of the year and offered RTX 2070 performance at similar power draw. An improvement over Vega for sure. However, given the node advantage, it was clear that architecturally, AMD were still miles behind Nvidia. The first implementation of Navi was a weird hybrid of old GCN and new RDNA architectures. Why they took that option, I'm not entirely sure, but it's likely been for time to market reasons. And for me, this hybrid chip was the straw that broke the camel's back. I have long said that I had given up on the GPU market. However, Navi was the final straw for real. For this mid-range Turing matching card to be priced on a similar level to Nvidia's mid-range cards, was a huge departure from AMD's previous strategy of competing aggressively on price. They had basically slapped $200 on the price of Polaris before climbing down to only $150 extra after Nvidia launched the Super refresh, with the 2070 Super again a little bit ahead of the 5700 XT. No longer competing at the high end and no longer competing on price. By the end of last year, I had reached the point of simply not being able to muster any kind of enthusiasm for an AMD graphics return. But then I started to hear some very interesting things about Big Navi's performance. Leaks on Big Navi have been rather thin on the ground, both for myself and for everyone else. If anything, we've got more information out of the next generation game consoles, but I'll get to those later. Last December, there was a leak on a Chinese bulletin board which talked of a 505 square millimeter chip called Navi 21. Even for Chinese, this was an unreasonably bad translation. However, there were a couple more details of the 7nm Plus, which is the EUV node being used. The current Navi chips are based on N7P, which is a slightly improved version of N7 that we see with Zen 2. And finally, it will supposedly use GDDR6 memory. Now, a few things didn't really add up so well with this information, I felt. If we look at this annotated Navi 10 die shot from Sashley Cat, which looks like a decent attempt, and we know Navi 10 is this 251 square millimeter chip, and it's got 40 compute units, we can see in the red, and a 256-bit memory bus. And if we double this, then we would get very close to 505 square millimeters. So far, so good. However, all this fixed function hardware, stuff like the video encoder, the I/O, basically everything you see here on the left of the chip, this should be the same size on any Navi chip, regardless of how many compute units the chip has. And this command processor shouldn't really be much larger on a larger chip either. So certain parts of the graphics chip should stay almost the same size, regardless if it's Navi 10, Navi 12 or Navi 21. So if we just say that this whole I/O part and the command processor, everything that is shared amongst designs comes in at around 50 square millimeters. That means that the rest of this Navi chip, the CUs, the ROPs, the memory controllers, would come in around 201 square millimeters. But in the case of the big Navi chip, that would be 455 square millimeters, which is a lot more than just twice as large. On top of that, if this is actually N7 EUV, as the leak suggested, N7 Plus, then it should come with an area reduction of around 17%. EUV is 17% denser than 7nm, but let's just call that 10% smaller. And in the case of Navi 21, we would be back at around 500 square millimeters again. So this 200 square millimeter Navi 10 chip without all the I/O would be around 500 millimeters for big Navi 21 without all the I/O. That is now 2.5 times larger, so what's taking up all the extra area? On top of that, if you're just doubling everything in Navi 10, so 40 compute units becomes 80 compute units, and this 256-bit memory bus becomes 512-bit, there is something of an issue here because a 512-bit GDDR memory bus hasn't been seen since 2013, and that was with Hawaii, AMD's Hawaii chip, and we can see the 512-bit memory bus around the edge, and you can probably see that, but Hawaii's 512-bit memory bus was optimized to be much smaller and more power efficient than a typical 512-bit bus. It's possible that Navi 21 could theoretically have a 384-bit bus instead, and that would come with faster GDDR6. However, if that is the case, then that means there is even more area on this 505 square millimeter chip to question. Could that mean that there might even be more than 80 compute units on Big Navi? It could, but the problem with that is that would soon reach a point where only having the 384-bit memory bus couldn't feed the shaders fast enough. So it would seem that this 505 square millimeters Big Navi 21, this leaked information, doesn't really add up in terms of compute unit count and die size. However, there is a potential unknown factor in ray tracing, which, like all this I/O, could be fixed function, and that could explain the extra 100 plus square millimeters of the larger Navi 21 chip. The next leak we got was actually of an unnamed Radeon graphics card running the OpenVR GPU benchmark. At the same settings, it scored 17% higher than the 2080 Ti. However, according to the developer of the benchmark, this was no ordinary 2080 Ti. In fact, these two 2080 Ti's shown here were really well performing 2080 Ti's, with the majority of 2080 Ti's performing more around the 80 frames per second mark. And the author reckoned that this unnamed AMD GPU was likely 29% faster than the average 2080 Ti. And what's more, this AMD engineering sample CPU turned out to be a Zen 2 based laptop chip, the Ryzen 7 4800H. So unless the benchmark was fake somehow, and note that this is not a fake screenshot, as this benchmark actually exists in OpenVR, it seems very likely that AMD has this GPU, which at that point in time is at least around 30% faster than the 2080 Ti. And the latest leak from a few days ago came from a Twitter user called CyberpunkCat, and that soon gained some traction. Apparently, one of his friends from inside SK Hynix sent him this image with the details of a GPU config called D32310/15. The supposed specs of this were 5120 shaders, 320 TMUs, 96 ROPs, 80 compute units, and 12 megabytes of L2 cache. Regarding the memory configuration, it would have 24 gigabytes of HBM2E, which has a width of 4096 bits, and a total bandwidth of 2 terabytes per second. And to the right, we can see the words 5950 XT and PCV. Now again, there were quite a few parts of this that didn't quite seem to add up, mostly on the memory side of things. And we only had to wait 2 days before SK Hynix themselves moved to rubbish the rumour with this post over at their newsroom. Recently, there have been media reports about SK Hynix's memory HBM2E and AMD's next generation GPU based on the allegations by a Twitter user, CyberpunkCat, which are factually incorrect. And SK hereby announces that the company has not created or distributed such specifications, as well as the document asserted to be leaked by an internal source. And after a thorough investigation, they concluded that the screen capture of the alleged internal document was a fake. First of all, the specifications of their HBM2E shown in that document are incorrect, but perhaps more tellingly. Secondly, for those of you who are not familiar with Korean, which will be most of us, I would think, this text at the right of the document says, "With local communities, 2020 happiness," which clearly is not related to HBM2E development or GPU. And moreover, they found that this text actually appeared on the main page of their Korean newsroom as a title for one of their content. And actually, if you look at the bottom of it, you can see fiscal year 2019 earnings. So it looks like it's been something that's been copy and pasted onto something else. And that would appear to be the end of that, though I do think it's rather odd of SK to get involved, and it makes me wonder if there is some truth behind it. The Twitter user then deleted the post and issued a statement asking people to stop spreading the information before proceeding to create a new tweet with the same specs and more information, which included a base clock of 1700 MHz and a boost of 1850 MHz, and also 350 watts TDP, and this time an even larger die size of 550 square millimeters. The problem with these updated specs is that HBM controllers are much smaller than GDDR, which would mean that there is even more space to account for with this supposed 80 compute unit chip. 80 compute units with HBM2 at 550 square millimeters, that just doesn't add up. And I had a look through the Twitter user's previous posts and found a retweet from Komachi which mentioned this 5950 XT. And in a way it looks like maybe this guy's compiled a wish list, then presented it as a leak, and now some facts. But that's not to say that some of these specs won't be real, or close to the end product. But based on the die sizes, I'm fairly certain that these will not be the final specs. So those 2 or 3 leaks are pretty much it for the stuff that we know about Big Navi. For myself, the information has also been pretty thin on the ground. Around the middle of last year, I got information that Navi Instinct was delayed until the first or second quarter of 2020. At that point, I wasn't even aware of such a thing as Navi Instinct, let alone that it was delayed. I would say that was from a good source with some good information, and some that so far at least hasn't come true. In October last year, I got a very large amount of information from an exceptional leaker, and that was again on Navi Instinct. I talked about it a little towards the end of this Tech Rumour Mill number 2 video, around about the 28-minute mark, where I noted that Navi Instinct showed up in a roadmap slated to arrive around the middle of the year, along with Milan. So we can see how dates tend to narrow down as we get closer to the launch. And then in early January, another great leaker simply sent me an email with these words: Big Navi is looking very good. And then later in the month, they followed up with reports back are 100% true. And then most recently, yet another source came to me with yet more information. And I will just quote it with the usual caveats of protecting my sources. RDNA2, the 6000 series, note that is not the 5950 XT of the other leak. The 6000 series has pretty much done away with what was left of GCN. And so IPC should be up as a result of that, which means it shouldn't need to clock that high for the same performance as Navi 10. However, the clocks are still undecided, so clearly ultimate performance is too. And then finally from that source, we're hoping for a third quarter launch. And so, assuming that in this case we're talking about the desktop card, the desktop Big Navi, hoping for the third quarter lines up decently with the Instinct card launching in the middle of the year. Further information came quickly, including a reiteration that performance still wasn't finalised, and that there were some interesting goings on with 1 or 2 BIOS issues, but those should be fixed soon. And also, the GPU appears to be very large. And while it does include ray tracing, it's not really anything meaningful. And the very last thing that I have heard about Big Navi was this. And I talked about this in the AdoredTV web podcast yesterday, so go check that one out if you haven't already. But I was told several people inside of Nvidia are worried about Big Navi's potential performance, and that they have decided to pull in the launch of the next generation Titan. And that is pretty much it. I cannot offer any clear specs on stuff like clock speeds or performance, as that hasn't been decided yet. However, that's all my leaked info on Big Navi, so take it for what it's worth. But what I can do for the final part of this video is offer up some analysis based on what we have, and also these next generation game consoles. The Xbox Series X was last week confirmed as a 12 teraflops GPU with variable rate shading and hardware accelerated DirectX ray tracing. Presumably that means that the GPU is optimised for their own DXR, which could be big news for Navi, and in fact AMD's ray tracing agenda. And it could also leave Sony in a bit of a pickle. But continuing with this article, Zen 2 we already knew about. However, RDNA 2 was finally confirmed as well. So the next Xbox is based on the same IP, the same architecture as Big Navi. 12 teraflops of GPU is twice the number of the Xbox One X, which is based on Polaris, and more than 8 times the original Xbox One. So this is 12 teraflops single precision FP32 compute. They've not got to this number through some kind of chicanery. It's a legitimate 12 teraflops GPU. So let's talk a bit about teraflops then to see what this could mean. Calculating teraflops is actually rather simple. You double the GPU boost clock, then multiply by the number of shaders, or stream processors as AMD calls them. So if we take a look at the RX 5700 XT for example, we can see it has a boost frequency of up to 1905 MHz. And I've made up a simple spreadsheet to show this simply. Enter the boost clock of 1905 MHz, and we can see that it doubles to 3810. And now we simply multiply by the number of shaders, 2560 stream processors, and dividing the final number by 1 million will give you the exact teraflops number of 9.754 teraflops. And that's what it says over at AMD.com. The peak single precision compute performance is 9.75 teraflops for the RX 5700 XT. So if everything scaled perfectly and equally, a 12 teraflops GPU would be 23% faster than a 9.75 teraflops GPU of the same architecture. And if I go over to Tech PowerUp's latest GPU review, which was the 5500 XT, and if we look at the 1440p results, which is what I normally use, this 12 teraflops GPU, if we look at the 2080 Super, which has 224% performance here, 224 divided by the 5700 XT's performance of 183, and that is almost bang on that 23% mark, which means if it all scales properly, the Xbox Series X GPU should be almost identical in performance to Nvidia's RTX 2080 Super. With the usual caveats. Obviously, we're talking 12 teraflops peak. We don't know what the average gaming clock is going to be, but that should give you an idea. And this is talking about the same Navi 10 RDNA 1 architecture. So simply scaling up from 9.75 teraflops to 12 teraflops, that puts you very close to 2080 Super performance. I talked a bit about the console chips in this recent analysis video on AMD on 7nm. And in the video I discussed this leak on GitHub, which suggested that the Xbox Series X GPU would have 56 compute units at 1.7 GHz. Now Navi 10, the 5700 XT, that's got 40 compute units. 40 compute units, 2560 shaders. So basically, there are 64 shaders per compute unit. So if I go back to the spreadsheet, 56 compute unit would have 3584 shaders. And remember, 1700 megahertz for the leaked information on GitHub, which gives us 12.186 teraflops. A 12 teraflop GPU. Fancy that. When I analysed this leak, I said that I had no real alternative but to assume that it was true. However, a 12 teraflops GPU fitting inside a typical console power envelope, that would not be possible with the current generation RDNA, or Navi 10. The 5700 XT already draws about 220 watts of power, and that is only 9.75 teraflops. So there are only two realistic options here. Either the Xbox X GPU draws a fair bit more power than a typical recent game console, and by that I mean we're possibly talking as much as 250 watts rather than 180 overall, or RDNA 2 is an awful lot more efficient than RDNA 1. So which one of those is more likely? Or could it be a combination of both? Well, we know for a fact that 12 teraflops is the official performance of the next Xbox, and we know that 12 teraflops was leaked before that. That could just have been a coincidence, or it could be true. I believe it is not coincidence, and I believe that this leak was true. And what that means is, these PlayStation 5 numbers, coming from the same leak, this is also almost certainly true. And so the PlayStation 5 will have a 36 compute unit GPU running at 2 GHz. 36 compute units is 2304 shaders. And we know the boost clock of 2 GHz doubles to 4 GHz, and that gives us 9.216 teraflops. And it does appear that there will be some distance between the Xbox and the PlayStation 5, in raw teraflops at least. But for me, what was most telling here is that it is hitting 2 GHz. Again, presumably within that same console type environment of around about 150, 180 watts of power. And at the end of this part of the analysis video, I said this larger, slower clocked chip that's got more CUs, and this smaller, higher clocked chip that's got less CUs, they should come in around about similar power levels. For me, the only really viable choice is to remain somewhat close to the classic power levels of a typical game console, if simply for design and cost purposes. So both of these new consoles are going to have pretty large APUs containing some of AMD's most advanced technology. We're not talking about Jaguar here. This is Zen 2, and RDNA 2 is the cutting edge of AMD's GPU technology. This cannot come cheap. And we also know that there's going to be solid-state drives in both of the consoles too. Are we now expected to believe that both of these consoles will have increased TDPs, more expensive cooling solutions, when they really need to hit that $400 to $500 price point? I can't see how it's doable. But now, to end this video, I'll keep all this console stuff in mind while getting back to the main subject of Big Navi. Let's assume that RDNA2 does not significantly increase IPC, for want of a better term, over RDNA1. And do note that IPC could be lower as well. There's no guarantees that it will go up from architecture to architecture. But if IPC remains around about the same, the PlayStation 5 should perform around a 5700 XT and the Xbox Series X around a 2080 Super. Going back to Tech Power Up's performance chart, and we can see the 2080 Ti at 260%. And remember, if we can believe this VR benchmark that was mentioned earlier, and the unnamed card which was 17% ahead of the faster 2080 Ti's and 29% ahead of the average 2080 Ti. 29% on top of this 260% gives us 335. So if we now calculate how much higher 335% is over the 2080 Super's figure of 224%, that gives us 49.5%. So this unnamed GPU should be about 50% faster than a 2080 Super, and therefore around 50% faster than the Xbox Series X GPU. And 50% more than 56 CUs. 56 plus 50% gives us 84 compute units. And that is close enough to say that Big Navi really is likely to be an 80 compute unit part, as both these other leaks suggested. Or again, we're basically talking twice Navi 10. And in fact, this is what I've believed for a long time. And I have also been told that these specs were true, which I believe was presumably the original leaked specs on the Chinese bulletin board. So 505 square millimeters with GDDR6. And if that is the case, there would appear to be quite a lot of space left over, and it probably will be fixed function ray tracing hardware. And while I will be surprised if this is the case, the analysis would suggest that AMD will go with another 512-bit memory bus, feeding a GPU this powerful with 384-bit, and also the larger than expected die size. It just kind of adds to that point. Again though, we don't know exactly what else is taking up the space. Where this gets interesting is on the clock speeds. When comparing Big Navi to the assumed Xbox GPU, I simply added 50% to the 56 compute units, which gave me 84. And that result would be 29% faster than the 2080 Ti. That also means though that I just kept the same clock speed of only 1700 MHz in order to get to that same 29% faster. However, like I said, the number of compute units on Big Navi is likely to be only 80, not 84. So the clock speeds will need to be up a little bit on 1700 MHz. If that's the case, it would need to be around 1785 MHz. But the thing here is, we can already be fairly sure that the chip will boost to at least 2 GHz based on the PlayStation 5. And this is the PlayStation 5 boosting in a power-limited environment, which Big Navi will not have. And sticking with the PlayStation 5, as I said, it should be 9.2 teraflops GPU, 36 compute units at 2 GHz. If we just double those number of shaders, 4608, that gives us 18.4 teraflops, 72 compute units at 2 GHz. And if we assume that we're talking a typical 150 watt GPU inside the PlayStation 5, just doubling it is going to come in around 300 watts. And what's more, if we go with 785 boost clock with 80 compute units, which is 5120 shaders, that gives us 18.278 teraflops. Very, very close to double a PlayStation 5. There's more than one way to skin a cat, as they say. And for me, all of this is starting to come together. This is just my best guess, but I reckon that first Big Navi GPU that we see, it's probably gonna be this 30% faster than a 2080 Ti. And the tech press will lose their minds over it, but I won't be all that impressed. For one, it's highly likely to be a cut down part. Probably, say, 72 compute units running at 1800 MHz. So 1800 MHz and 4608 shaders. That gives us 16.59 teraflops, compared to the 2080 Ti's 14.2 teraflops, which is only 17% faster. However, the rest of the performance should come from IPC gains, and also possibly higher bandwidth on the Big Navi part. They could also take the opportunity though to launch a 384-bit bus card with 72 compute units. And that's assuming I'm right about the full chip having a 512-bit bus. But for me, AMD will hold back the real big Navi until they see what Nvidia can conjure up. And for that, I think we're probably talking at least a 2 GHz boost, 80 compute unit or 5120 shader GPU, coming in at 20.5 teraflops. And this should be around about 50% faster than the 2080 Ti. Again, that would not blow me away, simply because I believe that Nvidia can also get 50% over the 2080 Ti on 7nm with relative ease. They have done more than 50% every time in recent history, and they will do it again on 7nm with relative ease. So 50% faster than the 2080 Ti is the minimum that I would expect for Radeon Technology Group to get back into this game. And if they are capable of playing it smart still, they need to fix all this stuff that I have been raging on them for recently. This is a big chance for them to get back into the game. Nvidia got lazy on 7nm, and now they are worried enough to be talking about 7nm Titans versus Big Navi. And what I would like to see from the Radeon Technologies Group would be a 6900 XTX, 80 compute units, 2.1 GHz, water-cooled and running around, say, 350 watts. This time though, it'll be HBM2. There's going to be an HBM2 Navi part, yeah? For the data center. But the leakiest parts of that, the worst parts of the wafer, they are still going to be superior than anything with GDDR6. HBM2 should help them to claw back a lot of power. And they should launch it as a limited edition card. Call it the Radeon Adrenaline Edition, RDNA, and seed that card to the tech press. And they've done similar stuff to this in the past. However, it was with cards that they couldn't win with, Fury X and Vega Liquid. This time though, they can win, even if it's only for a short time. When Big Navi finally launches, it'll have been 7 years since AMD last held the performance crown. And that was very, very brief as well, with the 290X. You don't get these chances very often. And the Radeon Technologies Group has now built up a great software suite, built up over years, and now they have their first truly competitive architecture for years coming as well. And that's why they need to fix their drivers, they need to fix their dumb shit with sandbagging and rushed BIOS updates, and they need to fix their coolers, because they might not get another chance. I'll catch you later, guys.